I never imagined my peaceful lakefront Saturdays would turn into a federal standoff. But that's exactly what happened after HOA Karen decided that my fishing boat didn't belong at my own dock. It started like most stories with these kinds, of people due with a clipboard, a fake smile, and an agenda. If you're someone who loves justice, neighbor drama, and watching karma strike like thunder, then stay right here and subscribe to Sham Stories, because this one will leave you stunned. I had moved into my quiet lakeside property 5 years earlier. It was supposed to be a dream come true, sunrises over the water, grilling on the deck, and my old fishing boat. Jenny B, parked right at my dock, ready for weekend adventures. I'd worked my whole life for this kind of peace. What I didn't know when I bought the place was that 3 years prior, the local HOA had been taken over by a woman named Karen Withers, a self-appointed enforcer of every rule she invented, rewrote, or just made up on the spot. She didn't build the community, she invaded it. Karen made her first appearance 2 weeks after I moved in full-time, knocking on my door with a manila folder in one hand and a frown that looked permanently attached to her face. "Just making sure you've read the updated dock guidelines," she said as a greeting. Inside the folder was a stack of paper labeled with HOA letterhead, though half the formatting looked like it had been copied from an old Word document and pasted together. Boats must be stored off-premises, unless cleared by the association board. I flipped through the paperwork and pointed out that my property had its own deeded dock. Not part of the shared marina, I told her. Private dock. Came. With the property? She blinked. That wasn't the response she expected. "Yes, well, we're working on a unified shoreline policy," she said quickly, as if rehearsed. "We can't have everyone doing their own thing. It disrupts the harmony of the lakeside aesthetic." I smiled politely and closed the door. That was the first time she stormed off. But it wouldn't be the last. Over the next few months, Karen escalated. First came the violation notices, yellow envelopes taped to my front door, citing me for unauthorized vessel storage and unapproved dock activity. Then she began photographing my boat from across the water, sometimes standing in the reeds behind other properties, just to get a better angle. Neighbors whispered about her antics, but no one dared challenge her directly. She had clawed her way into the HOA presidency and ran the board like a personal regime. People were scared of her. I wasn't. I gathered all my property documents, dock permits, zoning approval, and the original deed from the county and sent her a formal letter stating that she had no jurisdiction over my dock or boat. For a while, things went quiet. But Karen didn't go away. She waited. And then, one Saturday morning, I stepped out onto my dock and discovered that Jenny B was gone. My heart dropped. I scanned the water, checked the shoreline, thinking maybe it had broken free in the night. But the ropes were cut, clean and deliberate. Someone had taken it. I ran straight to my security cameras. Thankfully, I'd installed 2 motion-detecting cams after the 3rd fake violation notice. And there it was, in clear HD, Karen and 2 men. One of them a younger HOA volunteer with a gas-powered cutter, boarding my dock in the middle of the night, untying my boat and towing it away using a small outboard dinghy. I didn't even try to hide their faces. Karen stood at the front like a villain in a soap opera, arms crossed and triumphant. I was stunned, furious. And then I noticed something else. One of the men pulled out a radio and said something before they sped. Off across the water, that was my first clue that this wasn't just an overreach. This was organized. I wasn't going to let it slide. I called the sheriff's office immediately and filed a report for grand theft. But as I was giving them the statement, one of the deputies recognized Karen's name. "Wait," he said, "you mean Karen Withers? She's been flagged before for overstepping her authority with this HOA." He jotted down a note. "You said she had a radio and coordinated this with someone?" I nodded. "She's not acting alone," I said, and they knew exactly what they were doing. The deputy promised to start an investigation, but what happened next blew everything wide open. The next morning, I received an anonymous envelope in my mailbox, no return address, just a flash drive inside. I plugged it into my laptop and found a single video file. Showed Karen on a Zoom call with 2 other individuals, discussing cleaning up the lakefront and targeting properties they deemed non-compliant. What made it explosive was what she said near the end. If we can seize the boat and force a lien through the HOA, he won't be able to contest it. Just have it moved to lot storage and say it was a safety hazard. Once it's in our possession, we'll have leverage. My jaw dropped. She wasn't just making things up. She was orchestrating a theft for the purpose of gaining financial control over my property. I didn't wait another second. I sent the video to the county sheriff and then called someone else, my cousin Mitch, who worked with the Federal Property Crimes Task Force. When Mitch heard the audio, his tone changed. "This isn't just theft," he said. "This is attempted fraud with coordination across HOA members. You're looking at federal violations if any of the involved individuals used interstate communication or funds." Within 24 hours, Mitch's team was activated. They had already been building a case around abusive HOAs and were hungry for leads. Karen had no idea she had just dragged her whole board into a federal net. 2 days later, as I stood on my dock sipping coffee, a black SUV rolled into Karen's driveway, then another, and another. Agents in tactical vests calmly stepped out, walked up to her door, and knocked. When she opened it, I swear I saw her drop her phone. And behind her, just barely visible in the garage, was a second boat. Not mine, hers. One that wasn't registered. One bought with HOA funds she never disclosed. Mitch's team had done their homework. That's when the story truly exploded. But trust me, the way she screamed when they started searching her property, that's a sound I'll never forget. And if you thought this was wild, just wait. For what happened next, you won't believe how far Karen went to cover her tracks. As the agents entered Karen's home, she shouted accusations and demands, claiming it was all a misunderstanding and that the HOA had full legal authority over non-compliant lake vessels. But the FBI team wasn't buying her performance. Mitch had already briefed them with all the evidence, the Zoom recording, the security footage from my dock, and the breakdown of HOA funds that didn't match any official ledger. As they combed through her house, agents discovered files in locked drawers, external hard drives, and a handwritten notebook labeled Lakefront Compliance Operations. Inside were detailed lists of properties Karen had flagged, their estimated values, notes about leverage points, and mentions of targeting absentee owners. Worse, they found falsified letters she had drafted using fake city department letterheads to scare residents into surrendering rights to their docks or modifying their home exteriors. It was a pattern of control masked as regulation, and it had gone unchecked for years. Back at my cabin, I was contacted by several neighbors who had heard about the FBI showing up at Karen's house. Some were relieved, others nervous. One elderly couple told me Karen had once threatened to have their deck demolished because their chairs were not compliant with HOA-approved color schemes. A single dad said he was fined nearly $1,000 for leaving his canoe on the dock for one night. Karen had ruled the neighborhood like a tiny tyrant, and now that her mask had cracked, people were ready to talk. Mitch's team began collecting testimonies, each more outrageous than the last. Turned out Karen had a network of informants, people in the neighborhood who gave her information in exchange for immunity from HOA fines. They reported on things like how often people watered their grass, who had overnight guests, and whether anyone had installed unapproved decor. It was paranoia disguised as order. 2 days after the raid on Karen's home, agents returned with a warrant to seize her personal boat. She protested loudly in the driveway, claiming it was a gift from her late uncle. But the registration papers found inside her desk said otherwise. It had been purchased using HOA reserve funds and titled under a Shell LLC connected to Karen's personal P.O. box. It was one of the most obvious embezzlement moves the team had seen in a small community case. When they towed it away, Karen dropped to her knees in the gravel, shrieking that she was being targeted by deep state infiltrators. A few neighbors gathered at the edge of the street, watching in stunned silence. Someone filmed the entire scene and posted it online. Within hours, the video had hundreds of thousands of views. Karen screaming, the black boat being pulled down the street behind a government-marked trailer, and the unmistakable expression of someone watching their kingdom crumble. That clip became the symbol of the entire investigation, Mitch told me. The DOJ was reviewing the case for potential criminal charges beyond embezzlement, including abuse of position, wire fraud, and conspiracy to defraud homeowners. Karen was summoned for questioning, and though she showed up with a new lawyer and thick-rimmed glasses to appear more humble, her attitude hadn't changed. She still insisted that she was the victim of a coordinated smear campaign. She accused me, Mitch, the sheriff, and half the neighborhood of orchestrating a takedown to dismantle orderly governance. Her lawyer tried to argue that she acted in the interest of preserving property value, but when the prosecution showed a spreadsheet of her fake fines and where the money actually went trips to coastal resorts, boutique furniture, and landscaping on her own property, the courtroom turned ice cold. What made it worse was that she had signed all the HOA checks herself. No dual verification, no oversight. Just a single person making all the financial decisions under the guise of emergency authority. The HOA board, which had long been under Karen's thumb, began resigning one by one. They claimed ignorance, that she kept the books locked away and manipulated them into signing off on blanket approvals without full review. Whether that was true or not, the damage was done. The county issued a temporary injunction stripping Karen of any authority over HOA activities pending the investigation. An independent administrator was appointed to review all HOA decisions from the past 3 years. Karen, once the untouchable enforcer of lakeside law, was now barred from sending a single email to the neighborhood. But even as she faced mounting legal troubles, she continued her campaign of denial. She gave a bizarre interview to a Fringe podcast, claiming that I was part of a federal land reclamation plot and that my boat was a cover for water-based surveillance equipment. She spoke in vague conspiracies, hinted at fake military connections, and suggested that the real criminals were those who want to dissolve local control and hand it to the government. It would have been laughable if it weren't so dangerous. Few of her remaining loyalists, the ones who had benefited from her favoritism, started showing up around the lake, glaring at those of us who had spoken out. One even knocked on my door late one night, drunk and mumbling something about ruining a good thing. That's when Mitch advised me to install additional cameras and start documenting every suspicious encounter. Meanwhile, the legal process churned forward. A grand jury was convened to determine if formal charges would be filed. Karen was subpoenaed again, this time to produce all communication logs related to HOA activity. Redacted, but the forensic team recovered full backups from cloud storage she forgot to delete. They found everything. Her planning emails, her Zoom call with the boat seizure plan, even a draft letter to another HOA president in a different county suggesting they align enforcement efforts to set a new standard. That line was damning. It hinted at a wider scheme, one that could turn Karen's case into a state-level probe. The story had grown far beyond our neighborhood. News outlets started calling it Lakegate. HOA reform activists reached out asking if I'd speak. At their events, I declined, still trying to process it all. I hadn't asked for any of this. I just wanted my boat back. And speaking of the boat, Jenny B was finally recovered from an impound lot to counties over, where Karen's crew had stashed it under a fake name. It was scratched up, some gear was missing, but it was still seaworthy. I brought it home with a quiet sense of victory when I tied her back to my dock, this time with reinforced cables and new cameras watching from every angle. I felt a surge of pride. Not just because I got my boat back, but because we'd stood up to someone who thought she was untouchable. But the biggest surprise came a few days later, in a manila envelope delivered to my door. Inside was a letter from one of Karen's former HOA assistants, a whistleblower who claimed there was more, much more, that hadn't yet been uncovered. What I read inside that envelope, it changed everything. The envelope from the whistleblower, who signed only as RJ, contained a short handwritten note and several photocopies of documents that instantly made my skin crawl. I was complicit in some of this. The note began, "But I'm not going to jail for a woman who weaponized a lake." What followed were detailed logs, internal memos, and financial statements showing that Karen's HOA misconduct wasn't an isolated power trip. It was part of a multi-property strategy she had orchestrated over 3 years, targeting residents with high-value shoreline homes, applying fines or liens based on falsified rules, and then pressuring them to sell. Those properties, RJ revealed, were quietly purchased by shell companies connected to Karen's cousin, then flipped or rented back at a premium. There were emails between Karen and this cousin negotiating property prices, emails about removing obstacles like longtime owners who refused to bow to her policies, and even one where she described me directly. He's stubborn. But if we remove the boat and start stacking violations, he'll either leave or sell before summer. I handed all of it over to Mitch, who called me back the same night. This isn't just HOA overreach anymore, he said. This is organized real estate fraud, and Karen's cousin may be part of a criminal enterprise. The task force expanded its probe. They traced the cousins' LLCs, most of which were paper fronts operated out of a strip mall office in a nearby state. Financial records showed rapid property turnover, all from neighborhoods where Karen had been an HOA consultant or board member. In some areas, similar patterns emerged: boats mysteriously towed, docks suddenly declared unsafe, homeowners fined until they gave up and moved out. She wasn't just a tyrant, she was profiteering. The DOJ was now involved. Federal racketeering. Investigation was opened, and subpoenas were issued to banks, contractors, and HOA board members. Karen, cornered and visibly unraveling, refused to answer media inquiries. Even as local reporters staked out her house day and night, her cousin disappeared from public view entirely. As all this unfolded, our neighborhood began to change. People who had once been silent or afraid started stepping forward. An elderly widow admitted Karen had convinced her to sell her lakefront lot for half its market value under the pretense of pending code violations. A retired Navy veteran showed us doctored inspection reports Karen had sent him, claiming his retaining wall violated shoreline erosion rules even, though the county had no such ordinance. What we were uncovering wasn't just a scandal, it was a betrayal of trust that ran deep into the community's core. At the next emergency HOA meeting, over 60 residents packed into the community hall, most of them carrying documents, phones full of emails, and stories they were ready to share. For the first time, the board was no longer controlled by Karen loyalists. The remaining 2 members resigned on the spot, and an interim oversight committee was elected led by a retired judge, who lived down the road and had always kept to himself until now. He stood up and said simply, "I think it's time we clean this mess up, legally and permanently." Meanwhile, Karen's arrest seemed imminent, but she wasn't done scheming. One morning, Mitch called me with urgency in his voice. "She's trying to file bankruptcy," he said, "but we think it's fraudulent." She had attempted to transfer personal assets, including her boat, her cousin's LLC shares, and even her property into trusts under fake names, likely to shield them from seizure. The DOJ, however, was ready. They filed an emergency motion to freeze all her accounts. That same week, federal marshals arrived at her home with a seizure order. They took her electronics, remaining documents, and anything of value tied to the HOA. Karen was seen pacing her front lawn in tears, begging the agents to just let her keep the deck furniture. The video, yes, someone captured it, went viral like wildfire. But while some were laughing, I was still cautious. We hadn't seen the last of her, not by a long shot. True to form, Karen tried one last play. She filed a countersuit against the HOA itself, claiming she had been set up by a group of disgruntled homeowners with federal connections. The suit was weak, unsupported, and transparently desperate. It didn't even make it past preliminary hearing. But it revealed something even more telling. Karen still believed she was the victim. That mindset made her dangerous. The feds took this seriously. Mitch told me they were tightening security around key witnesses, especially since Karen's cousin was now considered a flight risk. More disturbing were whispers that other HOAs in nearby states were under audit, places where Karen had offered governance consulting in exchange for board influence. This wasn't just one HOA gone bad, it was a blueprint being used to consolidate neighborhood power for financial gain. I couldn't help but think how close I had come to losing my home, my boat, and possibly everything I'd worked for, just because someone decided I was in the way. That night I stood on my deck watching the moonlight reflect off the water, Jenny be bobbing gently at the dock. I thought of all the neighbors now working together, the fear that had finally broken, and the tide that had turned. But the real weight hit me when I opened a final email from RJ, just one line. Cryptic, but clear. She kept copies of everything, even the ones you haven't seen yet. What else was out there? What had Karen hidden away in those years? Of rule? Mitch promised to find out. And I was ready to help. Because it was no longer just about a stolen boat, it was about stopping a system that had gone unchecked for far too long. The final email from RJ kept gnawing at me. She kept copies of everything. That meant somewhere, either physically or digitally, Karen had an archive of documents, records, and maybe even communication trails that hadn't surfaced yet. Mitch's team already had access to what they seized during the warrant executions. But if Karen had backups, off-site locations, or encrypted cloud storage, then the scale of this scheme could be deeper than we had even begun to realize. I reached out to RJ again, using the burner email he had used previously, simply asking, "Where?" Hours passed with no reply. Then, in the middle of the night, I heard the ping of a new message. "Look inside the old Lake Committee archives. Check the cabin labeled 1 to C. It's not on the HOA map anymore." That was enough to send Mitch and 2 federal agents out the following morning. Cabin 1 to C was an abandoned property set back from the main road, hidden behind overgrown brush and tree lines. It had been vacant for years, supposedly condemned. But when the team pried open the door, what they found inside was anything but abandoned. Inside were 2 file cabinets, a desk covered in manila folders, and a dusty old desktop computer still plugged in. There were records dating back 6 years fins issued, photos taken, emails printed out and annotated by hand. And mixed among them were blueprints, not for construction, but for power. They showed a structured plan Karen had drawn up, outlining how to legally neutralize resistance within the HOA. Steps to rewrite bylaws without member votes, strategies to control quorum outcomes during board elections, and suggestions on how to remove undesirable homeowners through intimidation and escalation. Her terminology was chillingly clinical: soft target, push-out, asset flip funnel, and dock isolation strategy. It became evident that this wasn't just Karen being overzealous. This was predatory governance disguised as policy. In addition to paper files, the desktop computer yielded over 300 gigabytes of email backups, HOA communication logs, HOA meeting recordings, and a private email chain with her cousin that discussed flipping properties across multiple lakefront communities. There was even a draft email addressed to a lobbying firm, offering insights on how to professionalize compliance models based on her system. Karen had been building a business empire on the backs of her neighbors. As the documents were transported into evidence, a new dimension of the investigation opened. The DOJ assembled a cross-regional task force focused entirely on HOA fraud and exploitation. Karen was no longer just a neighborhood nightmare. She was now the centerpiece of a federal probe into real estate, manipulation through community governance. Her cousin, still missing, was rumored to have fled the state, and warrants were issued for his arrest. Meanwhile, public opinion around our HOA imploded. Residents held an emergency vote to dissolve the HOA entirely, opting instead for a voluntary civic association with no enforcement power. The community hall was turned into a co-op gathering space, and the fake fines and past violations were formally voided by court order. Many homeowners got refunds. Others joined a class action lawsuit against Karen and her shell entities. But even as her empire crumbled, Karen refused to go down quietly. She appeared on a late-night live stream hosted by a fringe neighborhood sovereignty group, ranting about how the government had invaded her peaceful community and stolen her vision. Her eyes were wild, her tone manic. She named me repeatedly, claiming I was an undercover federal plant who moved into the community to expose her. That claim, as absurd as it was, sparked a swarm of online trolls who began doxing me. A dress was leaked. A group of Karen sympathizers drove past my cabin, shouting obscenities. One threw eggs at my dock. Mitch intervened and filed an emergency protective order. The FBI also issued a formal warning to Karen that inciting harassment against a cooperating witness was grounds for further charges. Her lawyer begged her to stay offline. She didn't listen. That's when things escalated further. A local journalist following the case uncovered emails from Karen, offering payouts to former board members in exchange for silence. One of them turned over a secret recording of a meeting where Karen threatened legal retaliation against anyone who went public. "If they talk," she had said, "we bury them in liens and lawsuits until they can't breathe." That recording aired on public radio. It triggered outrage beyond our neighborhood. State legislators began reviewing policies related to HOA oversight. One congresswoman even proposed a Homeowner Protection Act aimed at curbing unchecked HOA powers and mandating external audits. Karen's case was no longer a community dispute. It was changing policy. But the final blow came when forensic accountants revealed something no one expected. Karen had filed fake insurance claims under the HOA's name after staging minor vandalism incidents at several properties. Security camera footage, recovered and enhanced, showed her throwing rocks through community bulletin boards, ripping down neighborhood signs, and slashing her own landscaping, all later claimed as vandalism for insurance payouts. This was insurance fraud on top of embezzlement, extortion, and conspiracy. Karen was arrested at a gas station outside city limits while trying to transfer cash to a relative's account. Her arrest photo spread like wildfire, no makeup, disheveled hair, and a look that screamed defiance even as the cuffs clicked into place. The community, once paralyzed by fear, erupted in relief. Neighbors who hadn't spoken in years now exchanged waves and smiles. The lake, calm and undisturbed, felt like it was breathing again. Jenny B., my boat, now sat proudly at my dock, polished and resecured. But even with Karen behind bars, the scars she left on our neighborhood would take time to fade. And yet, out of her tyranny, we found our voice. People started showing up at HOA town halls across the country, citing our case as an example of why unchecked neighborhood power needs oversight. Karen had tried to steal a boat, but she ended up giving a voice to every homeowner who ever felt bullied, lied to, or silenced by fake authority. And still, one final question lingered. What else was she hiding? That's what we would find in the last segment when the feds finally cracked her private cloud storage. When Karen's private cloud storage was finally accessed, thanks to a forensic IT team who bypassed her encrypted layers by tracing her login habits through one of her old HOA laptops, had revealed the most jaw-dropping details yet, the kind of evidence that made every previous violation, theft, and shady transaction look like child's play. Inside the archive, which spanned nearly 4 years, was a folder named Governance Playbook and another ominously labeled Special Operations. These files documented a disturbing number of case studies, notes, photos, and personal homeowner data from dozens of neighborhoods Karen had consulted on, not just in our state but across state lines. Each folder contained detailed personality profiles, family histories, income brackets, and pressure points of targeted residents. She had built a psychological warfare strategy for property, flipping through manipulation, legal intimidation, and social engineering. One particularly chilling document described how to push elderly residents into selling by initiating false safety inspections, then escalating fines until panic and confusion drove them into early buyouts. Another outlined how to pit neighbors against each other to create noise complaints, leading to official citations and public shaming. She didn't just use power, she studied people, learned how to break them, and turned HOA regulations into weapons. But perhaps the most damning evidence came from a collection of video diaries. In dozens of recordings, Karen spoke directly into a camera, detailing her plans with unflinching confidence. "The system gives me the tools. I just know how to use them," she said in one, smiling calmly as she boasted about manipulating zoning officials and threatening homeowners with fraudulent legal action. People don't read the fine print. People fear authority. All you have to do is act like you have power, and they'll fold. Her arrogance was recorded in full, along with several secret conversations with her cousin where they discussed laundering HOA funds through fake maintenance contracts. One clip showed them laughing after successfully pushing a family to sell, with Karen saying they didn't even realize the dock violations I cited don't exist in county code. That line was included verbatim in the indictment. With this new evidence, prosecutors expanded the charges to include wire fraud, mail fraud, conspiracy to commit racketeering, and violation of multiple homeowner protection laws. Karen's cousin was arrested in Colorado, where he had been hiding under a new name, living in a lakeside property purchased with embezzled funds. The news exploded across national outlets. Karen empire crumbles, read one headline. HOA queen turned crime boss faces life in prison, said another. Congressional hearings soon followed. Legislators cited our case as a wake-up call for HOA reform nationwide. And then, one afternoon, I was invited to testify, standing before a subcommittee on housing and community governance. I told the story plainly, not just about a boat, but about how easily power can be abused when it's unchecked, and how important it is to protect the rights of homeowners everywhere. I spoke for the quiet retirees Karen targeted, for the single parents she fined into debt, and for every family that just wanted to enjoy their home in peace. When I walked out, a young couple approached me in the hallway. "We saw your story online," the woman said. "We're fighting our HOA now, too." He gave us the courage. That was the moment I knew none of it was in vain. Karen is currently in federal custody, awaiting trial on 22 charges, and her assets have been frozen pending civil litigation from over 40 families. Our neighborhood, once fractured and afraid, now thrives as a true community. The dock is open. The flags wave, and the lake glistens every morning without the shadow of her presence. Jenny B floats at the edge of my deck, her hull polished and clean, a symbol of defiance, of justice, and of peace reclaimed.
Oh.
This wasn't just about a stolen boat, it was about standing up when no one else would. It was about proving that even in the smallest corners of America, people still have power when they unite against injustice. So if you ever find yourself face to face with a Karen who thinks she owns your property, your rights, or your voice, remember this: the law can be louder than the clipboard. The truth, once unleashed, always finds its way to the surface. If you love this story and want more wild tales of justice, revenge, and neighborhood drama, don't forget to subscribe to Sham Stories.